The cold rain of December punished the streets of New York when Isabella Martinez, just 22 years old and 6 months pregnant, was literally thrown on the sidewalk with a torn suitcase and $20 in her pocket. Her very visible belly stood out as she looked incredulously at the apartment where she had lived for 2 years. "You had 2 weeks to get the rent money, not 2 months, shouted Margaret Sullivan, the owner, before knocking the door tightly. "And it's no use standing there like a poor thing. I should have thought of it before you got pregnant without being able." Isabella never imagined that her life would crumble so quickly. He had arrived from Mexico 3 years earlier, with the American dream of studying nursing and building a better life. He worked double journey, in the morning as a nanny for a family rich in Manhattan and at night cleaning offices at the financial center, until he discovered the pregnancy and being fired from both jobs on the same day. The child's father? It had disappeared the same week she told about the baby, leaving only a cold message on her cell phone. "I'm not ready for that responsibility. Good luck with it." The neighbors watched from the window as she tried to organize her belongings scattered on the wet sidewalk. Some whispered evil comments about another immigrant wanting to live at the expense of the country. Others simply closed the curtains, pretending not to see the pregnant girl being publicly humiliated. Margaret Sullivan was still shouting from the apartment, "And don't dare to sleep near here. I'll call the police if you see you around the building." The 50-year-old owner of 6 properties in Queens seemed genuinely pleased to expel a pregnant woman during a winter storm. Isabella carried the heavy suitcase by blocks, feeling the contractions of Braxton Hicks caused by stress. On the first night, he slept at a bank at Central Park, waking up with his wet coat and painful body. On the second day, a coffee employee kicked her out when she tried to warm up, buying only a small coffee with the remaining coins. "This is an establishment for customers, not a shelter," said the employee, completely ignoring the state of Isabella. "If you won't consume right, you need to leave." It was on the third day, when I was weak, hungry, and tremendously, that something unexpected happened. Isabella had only gotten 2 hours of sleep when she woke up with someone standing next to her. An elegant man, about 60, watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Excuse me, miss," he said with a kind and refined accent. "Can I ask how long has been on the street?" Isabella raised her eyes, waiting for another humiliation, someone else wanting her to come back to her country. But what he saw in those blue eyes was something that had forgotten that existed: genuine compassion, without judgment or contempt. The man used an overcoat of impeccable wool and carried a leather paste that probably cost more than his old monthly salary. But there was something familiar in his gestures, in the way he spoke in Spanish fluent when he realized his discomfort with English. "You're waiting for a baby." It wasn't a question, but a gentle observation. "How long have you been with alone?" Isabella hesitated, but something in the respectful way he addressed her made the words come out. 3 days on the street. 3 months since everything collapsed. The stranger nodded slowly, as if processing information far beyond what she had shared. There was an intensity in his gaze that suggested that this meeting was not as casual as it seemed. "My name is Eduardo Montoya," he said finally, "and I have a proposal that can change your life completely. If you are enjoying this story of overcoming, you do not forget to subscribe to the channel, because what this mysterious man was about to offer would change not only Isabella's fate, but would reveal secrets about her own past that she even knew herself. Sometimes the universe puts right people in the right place, but was Isabella prepared to find out that nothing in her life had been truly coincidence? Eduardo Montoya did not look like a man who made empty offers. While Isabella processed his words, he opened the leather paste and removed a business card with golden edges. "Montoya Enterprises, Real Estate Development," read in elegant letters. "Listen, Isabella," he said, surprising her by using her name, although she didn't remember presenting herself. "I have an unusual proposal. I need someone to manage a special project of mine, and you have exactly the profile I look for." Isabella laughed bitterly. "Sir, with all due respect, look at me. I'm pregnant, no home, no job. What kind of project could I manage? Precisely for this." Where Eduardo, his blue eyes gaining a peculiar intensity. "I need someone who truly understands what it is to fight for survival. Someone who is not afraid to work hard because he has lost everything once." For the next 2 weeks, Isabella's life changed surreally. Eduardo installed her in a modest apartment at Upper West Side, paid her prenatal consultations, and offered a salary that was more than she earned in her 2 previous jobs added. All she asked for in return was that she would accompany him in her inspection visits around the city. This is how Isabella discovered the real business of Eduardo Montoya. He was not just a real estate developer, he was a predatory owner hunter. His company bought real estate from people who exploited vulnerable tenants, forcing explorers to sell through perfectly legal but devastating methods. Margaret Sullivan is our next acquisition. Eduardo said a morning, showing Isabella a folder full of documents. The property where you lived is just one of the 6 you have, all with a history of illegal evictions, abusive charges, and unhealthy conditions. Isabella felt her heart accelerate. Did you know who I was from the first day? I knew you were unjustly poured out by her, yes, but I didn't know you would find exactly the person you needed to execute my plan. Eduardo smiled in an enigmatic way. You see, Isabella, that Margaret has a weak point, her uncontrolled greed. Through a fictitious company, Eduardo had made an irreplaceable offer for all Margaret properties, 40% above market value, cash payment. The only condition was that she needed to deliver all completely empty apartments in 30 days. She is forcing mass evictions, explained Eduardo. Whole families being thrown on the street in the middle of winter, all to profit from my fake offer. Isabella observed the photos that Eduardo had collected, children crying being taken from home, elderly carrying belongings in garbage bags, whole families sleeping in cars. Margaret Sullivan was repeating with dozens of people exactly what she had done with her. And here comes your part on the plan, said Eduardo, giving him a legal power of attorney. As my official representative, you will be present in the signing of the contracts. Margaret will find that the pregnant woman she has played on the street now controls the fate of all her real estate empire. But there was something in Eduardo's smile that Isabella couldn't completely decipher, a personal satisfaction that went beyond simple social justice. He knew Margaret Sullivan from somewhere, that was obvious, but where? On the eve of the meeting, Eduardo revealed another piece of the puzzle. Isabella, I need you to know something about your own story before tomorrow. He showed him an old birth certificate and a faded photo of a smiling young Mexican. This is Elena Martinez, your mother, and this, said, showing a second picture where the same woman appeared next to a young man in military costume, was taken 6 months before you are born. Isabella held the photo with trembling hands. The young military man had the same blue eyes as Eduardo Montoya. What Isabella did not know was that her arrival at that marquise 3 weeks ago had not been coincidence. Eduardo had been looking for her for over 20 years, and Margaret Sullivan had made the fatal mistake of awakening the wrong man's attention to throwing his own daughter on the street. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella held the photo with trembling hands, comparing the young military's blue eyes with those of Eduardo. The resemblance was undeniable, but his mind fought against the reality that unfolded before her. You're my father. It wasn't a question, but a whispered finding that echoed through the elegant apartment room where Eduardo had installed her. Elena Martinez worked for my family when I was 19, Eduardo began, his laden voice for a long time dammed. I was young. She was just 2 years older. We fell in love, but my parents discovered and sent her away immediately. I never knew she was pregnant. Isabella felt the baby kick inside her belly as if she responded to the revelation. Why did you never seek me? I looked, Isabella, for 22 years. Eduardo opened a drawer and removed a thick paste. His mother changed his name, disappeared completely. I hired private detectives. I traveled shelters, hospitals, immigration records. It was only when you were dumped that I finally found it. The folder contained hundreds of documents, research reports, old photos of pregnant Elena, hospital records, lists of fake names she had used. Eduardo had spent a fortune trying to find his daughter that I knew it existed. Margaret Sullivan will be our first victory together, said Eduardo, his eyes now shining with a determination that Isabella recognized as a familiar. But she's just the tip of the iceberg. There are others like her, others who take advantage of vulnerable people. During the following days, Isabella discovered the extension of Eduardo's hidden empire. He was not just rich, he was strategically powerful. Montoya Enterprises had a network of companies specializing in identifying and buying properties from real estate explorers, forcing them to sell through perfectly legal methods. Each property we acquire becomes subsidized popular housing, explained Eduardo. People who have been dumped have priority to return, paying only 30% of what they charged before. Isabella was processing too much information. In 3 weeks, he had passed a pregnant homeless to the heiress of an empire dedicated to social justice. But there was something more in Eduardo's strategy to Margaret Sullivan, something personal he had not yet revealed completely. 22 years ago, when her parents sent me away, Margaret Sullivan was secretary of the family law firm, Eduardo said in an afternoon. She was the one who falsified the documents that made her mother look like a criminal, forcing her to flee the country. The puzzle finally completed. Margaret had not only dumped Isabella, she had destroyed the family that never graduated. The woman who threw a pregnant woman on the street was the same as who had separated father and daughter, even before Isabella was born. The meeting with Margaret is scheduled for tomorrow, said Eduardo. She thinks she's signing the biggest business of her life. In fact, she's signing her own ruin. That night, Isabella could barely sleep. He felt the baby move restlessly, as if presenting the storm that was coming. In the morning, Eduardo handed him a different folder. It contained not only the false contracts, but also copies of the documents Margaret had falsified 2 decades ago. "When she realizes who you are," said Eduardo, "I want her to understand that some injustices take an entire generation to be corrected." Isabella touched her belly, thinking of the cruel irony of being about to confront the woman who had destroyed her family even before she was born. Margaret Sullivan had thrown 2 generations of Martinez women on the street, but never imagined that one of them would return with the power to destroy everything she had built. What Margaret didn't know was that the most important business meeting of her life was about to turn into the most devastating confrontation she had ever faced, led by the same pregnant young woman that she had humiliated just a month ago and who carried the 3rd generation she could never harm in her womb. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Morrison & Associate law firm in the heart of Manhattan. Margaret Sullivan arrived 15 minutes earlier, radiating the confidence of those about to close the business of his life. 40% above market value cash payment, murmured to herself, setting the expensive blazer while waiting in the luxurious meeting room. "I will finally get rid of those problematic properties and still profit a fortune." At 52, Margaret had built her real estate empire exploring vulnerable tenants, immigrants, low-income families, non-documentation people. All were perfect targets for their abusive collection schemes and illegal evictions. Lawyer Morrison entered accompanied by Eduardo Montoya and a pregnant girl who Margaret did not recognize immediately. He was very busy admiring Eduardo's impeccable suit and mentally calculating the zeros in his bank account after the transaction. "Miss Sullivan," said Eduardo politely, "I would like to present my legal representative, Isabella Martinez Montoya." Margaret's blood froze when he heard his name and finally focused on the young woman's face. The same pregnant girl she had thrown on the street a month ago was sitting at the mahogany table, wearing an elegant suit and carrying a cool document folder. "Impossible," whispered Margaret, his voice failing. "She can't be here. She's just a homeless immigrant that you dumped illegally during a winter storm," Isabella completed calmly, opening her folder. "Yes, I'm exactly that person." Eduardo smiled in an enigmatic way. "You'll see, Margaret, there are some things about our purchase proposal that we haven't fully discussed." Isabella withdrew a series of chronologically organized photographs from the folder. They were devastating images of all the families that Margaret had dumped last month to empty the apartments. Children crying in the cold rain, elderly carrying belongings in garbage bags, whole families sleeping in cars parked on the street. "These are the 47 families you forced to leave your homes in the last 30 days, said Isabella, her voice keeping a professionally neutral tone that made the situation even more disturbing. "All based on the same fraudulent contract you plan to sign with us today." Margaret tried to get up, but her legs failed. "You can't prove anything. All the evictions were cool." "In fact," intervened Lawyer Morrison, "we can prove much more than you think." He put a second folder on the table, notably thicker. "These are copies of the counterfeit documents you have prepared for 22 years for Elena Martinez, forcing her to flee the country." The color completely disappeared from Margaret's face. Elena Martinez was a name she had buried for decades, along with the documents she had forged to separate a family and please the powerful bosses of the time. "Elena Martinez was my mother," said Isabella, her voice now loaded with emotion, contained but controlled. "And this," she pointed to Eduardo, "is my father, the man you kept to know me for 22 years. Eduardo stood slowly, each movement calculated to maximize the psychological impact. "You know, Margaret, when I found out that you had dumped my daughter, initially thought of simply destroying your life financially, but then I realized it would be unfair to do it without you knowing exactly why I was being punished." Margaret tried to speak, but only a strangled moan came out of his throat. The puzzle pieces fitted devastating into his mind, forming a panorama of meticulously planned revenge. "The purchase proposal was false from the beginning," continued Eduardo, each word being pronounced with the accuracy of those who had rehearsed that moment for decades. "We never intended to buy your properties. Instead, we used the last month to systematically document every crime you committed against vulnerable tenants." Isabella opened a third folder, revealing hundreds of documents organized by categories. Illegal charges documented with message prints, threats recorded in audio, evictions performed without court order, unhealthy housing conditions purposely ignored. His voice now carried the controlled satisfaction of those who saw justice being made methodically. "We have video testimonials, date and time photographs, internal documents from your own company that you thought you destroyed." The lawyer Morrison smiled coldly, removing an even more bulky folder. "Oh, and we also have the full confessions of their employees. Apparently, when they face federal criminal accusations, People are surprisingly willing to collaborate with the authorities in exchange for winning delation agreements. Margaret tried to recover the composure, but her voice came out. This is a frame. You have no authority for authority? Isabella laughed low, a sound that echoed through the room with sharp irony. You know, a month ago you told me that I should have thought of the consequences before getting pregnant without being able. Today I want to ask, did you think about the consequences before destroying 2 generations of my family? Eduardo withdrew his cell phone, typing quickly. As we talked here, federal agents are simultaneously executing search and seizure warrants in all files of their other 6 offices. Their employees are already being taken to interrogation about the money laundering scheme we discovered connected to massive illegal evictions. Money laundering? Margaret shouted, her now hysterical voice. This is completely ridiculous. Isabella showed her a 5th paste, marked with federal stamps. Bank accounts in Cayman Islands tax havens, properties recorded on fictitious names spread across 3 states, monthly bribes documented to civil servants to accelerate eviction processes. His voice now carried not only satisfaction, but an authority that Margaret had never seen in the young vulnerable he had dumped. 22 years investigating you, Margaret. You have no idea of the actual extension of the crimes you have committed systematically. The room door opened with timed accurately and 2 federal agents entered, their credentials already visible. Margaret Sullivan is arrested for large-scale real estate fraud, continued extortion, falsification of public documents, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit crimes against civil rights. As they put the handcuffs, Margaret looked desperately to Eduardo, his latest negotiation hopes still flashing in his eyes. Please, we can negotiate something. I have money hidden, I can pay offsets, whatever it takes. Eduardo shook his head slowly, every deliberate movement. The only thing I want from you, Margaret, is that you understand a very simple lesson. Some injustices take 2 decades to be corrected, but when that happens, justice is not just executed, it is absolute and irreversible. While Margaret was conducted handcuffed by the agents, Isabella remained sitting, a protective hand on her belly where her son grew. The same woman who had been thrown into the street a month before trash now controlled the fate of those who had destroyed her family even before she was born. What Margaret didn't know was that her arrest was just the first movement of a much larger plan. Isabella had inherited not only a father and a fortune, but an empire dedicated to identifying and neutralizing systematic explorers, and that this would be the first of many families who would be gathered and revenge that would be executed with the surgical accuracy of those who transformed personal injustice into a life mission. 6 months later, Isabella walked the streets of the same Queens where she had slept in the rain, but now she carried her 3-month-old daughter, Sophia Elena, on her lap. The baby slept quietly as they visited the first of the housing complexes that the Martinez-Montoya Foundation had inaugurated. The building where Margaret Sullivan had dumped whole families now housed popular housing with subsidized rent. Golden plates at the entrance showed the names of all 47 families who had been forced to leave. Each had returned to renovated apartments paying only 1/3 of the previous value. Miss Isabella, greeted Donna Carmen, a 73-year-old lady who had been dumped at 72. My granddaughter asked if you can come to dinner Sunday. You want to thank the lady who brought the whole family back home. Isabella smiled, straightening her daughter in her arms. In the last 6 months, Eduardo had officially transferred to her the presidency of the foundation that grew exponentially. They had already identified 12 other predatory owners in the New York metropolitan region, all following the same meticulous research pattern that destroyed Margaret. Margaret Sullivan, in turn, had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the right to parole. Its 6 properties were confiscated by justice and transformed into social housing. Money washed off in offshore accounts has been fully reversed to a repair fund to victims of their crimes. Irony is perfect, Eduardo had commented on the day of the sentence. She spent her life throwing families on the street to profit. Now she'll spend her next 15 years unable to get out of her own room. Isabella's story gained national dimensions when an investigative journalist discovered the extent of the operation. From pregnant home to social justice, the history of the woman who turned injustice into revolution was the cover of 3 national magazines in the same week. The television program that told its career generated more than 500,000 messages from people sharing similar real estate exploration stories. Isabella created a direct line where victims could report abuse, and the foundation investigated each complaint systematically with the same surgical accuracy used against Margaret. Law universities began to study the Martinez-Montoya case as an example of social justice applied through legal methods. Isabella was invited to lecture at Harvard, Yale, and Columbia on how to transform personal injustice into systematic change. Mom would have been proud, Isabella muttered to Sophia Elena while watching children playing in the retired courtyard. Eduardo had located the tomb of Elena Martinez in Mexico and built a memorial in his honor on the same land where the foundation of the foundation was now operating. Dr. Morrison, who had become a permanent lawyer for the foundation, appeared with a folder of new cases. We have 23 new complaints this week. 2 seem particularly serious. Owners forcing elderly evictions during the hurricane season. Isabella nodded, the focus immediately changing to the strategic way she had developed. Prepare the complete dossiers. I want to know all about them. Financial history, political connections, behavioral pattern. If we will overthrow these explorers, we will do as smart as possible. Eduardo, now officially grandfather and constantly carrying gifts to Sofia Elena, watched Isabella command operations with a mix of paternal pride and professional admiration. You know you have turned something horrible into a good force, don't you? I learned with the best, Isabella replied, smiling at her father he had lost and found the same year. And I learned that the best revenge is not to destroy those who have harmed you. It is to build something so much greater that they become completely irrelevant. The foundation had already sued and overcome cases against 12 different real estate explorers. Each victory resulted not only in arrests and fines, but in the transformation of exploiting properties into dignified housing for low-income families. There is something poetic in using our own system that oppressed us to create justice, Isabella explained in her lectures. Margaret thought he was throwing garbage on the street when he poured me. In fact, he was planting the seed of his own destruction. Sofia Elena woke up in her mother's arms, her blue eyes, inheritance of the Montoya, watching the world curiously around. 3 generations of women Martinez had faced different injustices, but only Isabella had had the opportunity and the resources to turn personal pain into systematic power of social change. Margaret Sullivan, in his federal cell, received weekly reports about the families returning to the apartments she had used for exploration. Every news was a reminder that his cruelty had created just the opposite of what he intended, more dignity for the people he tried to destroy. Margaret's last letter, wrote from prison, never sent, simply said, I never imagined playing a pregnant woman on the street would cost me everything. If I could go back in time, but there is no time machine for cruelty. There is only certainty that people like Isabella Martinez Montoya will continue to turn injustices into revolutions, one family saved at a time. The universe has a peculiar way of balancing its accounts. Sometimes it takes decades, sometimes needs the help of certain people, but in the end, those who plant systematic cruelty reap exactly the destruction they deserve. Isabella Martinez Montoya learned that there is no coincidence when it comes to true justice. There is preparation, finding opportunity, courage finding resources, and people brave enough to turn their own pain into collective healing of others who suffer the same injustices. If you believe that all injustice deserves an intelligent response and that the best revenge is the success that builds bridges instead of burning other people, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who have turned their biggest defeats into the most inspiring and systematic victories you have ever seen. Because sometimes when the world throws you on the street thinking that you are disposable, you have 2 choices: accept the floor as your definitive place, or use that same floor as a solid foundation to build something infinitely larger and longer than your oppressors could never destroy or even imagine.